In 1922, archaeologist Howard Carter opened a sealed door in Egypt's Valley of the Kings and found one of the greatest treasure hoards in human history, the untouched tomb of the boy king Tutankhamun. Gold masks, golden chariots, 5,000 objects packed into 4 chambers that had sat sealed and untouched for 3,000 years. The world called it the greatest archaeological discovery ever made. Scientists spent the next 100 years studying every inch of it. And then, decades later, radar scanners pointed at the walls of that same tomb picked up something nobody expected: hollow spaces. Voids. Gaps behind the rock that had no business being there. And one leading theory about what's hiding inside those walls is so extraordinary, so potentially world-changing, that the archaeology community has been quietly arguing about it ever since. What if the most famous tomb ever discovered was built on top of an even bigger secret? What if, just meters away from King Tut's burial chamber, the most mysterious queen in Egyptian history has been silently waiting this entire time? This is the story of Nefertiti's missing tomb, and why the answer might already be within arm's reach. To understand why this matters so much, you have to understand who Nefertiti actually was, because most people know her face, and almost nothing else. She was the Queen of Egypt during the 14th century BC, the wife of the controversial pharaoh Akhenaten, the ruler who threw out Egypt's entire religious system, banned the worship of the traditional gods, and replaced them all with a single deity centered on the sun. It was one of the most radical political and religious upheavals in the ancient world, and Nefertiti was right at the center of it. Ancient art depicts her as not just a royal wife, but an active co-ruler shown in carvings smiting enemies, conducting religious ceremonies, and wearing the double crown typically reserved only for pharaohs. Some historians believe she may have actually ruled Egypt outright after Akhenaten's death, possibly under a different name, before Tutankhamun came to the throne as a boy. She was powerful, she was prominent, and she was everywhere in the historical record, right up until the moment she simply wasn't. And that disappearance is the heart of this mystery. Despite her enormous historical importance, despite being one of the most documented queens of ancient Egypt, her tomb has never been found. No confirmed burial site. No mummy. No sealed chamber with her name on it. For decades, that absence has been one of Egyptology's most frustrating open questions, because a queen of her status simply had to have been buried somewhere extraordinary. And then came the radar scans. In recent years, researchers using high-resolution ground-penetrating radar on the walls of Tutankhamun's burial chamber detected something that stopped them cold. Behind the north and west walls of the chamber walls that every scientist for 100 years had assumed were solid rock there appear to be voids. Empty spaces. Anomalies that don't match the surrounding geology. And here's where the theory that has divided the archaeological community takes shape. Look at Tutankhamun's tomb from a structural standpoint, and something feels off. Compared to other royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings, it is unusually small. The layout doesn't quite match the design typical for a male pharaoh of his status, but it does match, almost precisely, the design conventions typically used for a queen's burial. Some Egyptologists have argued for years that the tomb was not originally built for Tutankhamun at all, that it was a pre-existing royal burial that was hastily repurposed when the young king died unexpectedly at around 19 years old, likely before his own tomb was finished. And if that's true, if Tutankhamun was buried in someone else's space, then the original occupant's chamber might still be there, sealed behind those walls, untouched since the day it was closed. And the leading candidate for who that original occupant might be is Nefertiti herself. The wall paintings inside the tomb add another layer to this. Certain subtle features in the artwork have led researchers to suggest that sections of the tomb may have been modified or repurposed after its original construction, artistic signs that the space was not designed with Tutankhamun in mind. If those anomalies behind the walls turn out to be sealed doorways or corridors, and if those corridors lead to a burial chamber that predates Tut's own entombment, the implications would be staggering. A sealed royal tomb untouched for over 3,000 years containing artifacts, inscriptions, and possibly an intact royal mummy would be the single most important archaeological discovery since Carter himself cracked open that sealed door a century ago. But here's where it gets complicated, because this isn't a settled debate. Not even close. Later scans using different technologies produced inconsistent results, some confirmed anomalies, while others found no clear evidence of chambers at all. The scientific community is split, and without invasive investigation, nobody can say with certainty what's actually behind those walls. And invasive investigation carries its own terrifying risk. Tutankhamun's burial chamber is one of the most fragile archaeological spaces on Earth. The wall paintings, 3,000-year-old images that have survived intact through 30 centuries of heat, seismic activity, and shifting desert, could be permanently destroyed by a single wrong move. Drilling into that chamber without absolute certainty of what's on the other side is a gamble most researchers aren't willing to take. So the radar keeps scanning. The debate keeps going. And Nefertiti, if she's there at all, keeps waiting. But the mystery of hidden things in plain sight doesn't stop at Nefertiti. Because while the world was busy studying Tutankhamun's tomb from the outside, there was another mummy sitting in the same Valley of the Kings that almost nobody talks about, a mummy so unusual, so perfectly and intricately wrapped, that for over 100 years researchers have refused to open it, not out of superstition, but out of sheer scientific caution. It's called the Bashiri mummy, and it may be one of the most important untouched finds in Egypt. Howard Carter, the same man who discovered King Tut's tomb in 1922, reportedly stumbled upon the Bashiri mummy 3 years earlier in 1919, in the same valley, during an earlier survey. And unlike virtually every other mummy ever found, this one has never been unwrapped. The linen covering the mummy's face features an extraordinarily intricate design pattern that researchers believe may be completely unique in the known archaeological record, possibly a one-of-a-kind embalming style that has never been documented anywhere else. And that's precisely the problem. Without understanding the exact technique used to wrap it, there is no safe way to unwrap it and put it back. The golden rule of working with antiquities is absolute. If you cannot guarantee you can preserve or restore what you disturb, you do not disturb it. History has handed down too many painful examples of what happens when that rule gets broken. So the Bashiri mummy sits. X-ray scans have revealed it belonged to a man approximately 5.5 feet tall, dating to the Ptolemaic era, making it roughly 2,300 years old. Scans also picked up an inscription of his name. Though even that detail is contested, researchers can't agree whether it reads Pacheri or Nen. A man whose face is perfectly preserved, whose wrappings are unlike anything else in Egypt, and whose name we can't even confirm. Another ancient identity hovering just out of reach. And while the Bashiri mummy was spared the ordeal of examination, Tutankhamun himself was not so fortunate. What happened when Carter's team finally opened the boy king's innermost coffin in 1925 is one of the most extraordinary and difficult episodes in the entire history of archaeology, a race between scientific urgency and the fragility of a body that had survived 3,000 years only to face something it was never designed to endure. When the nested coffins were finally opened, Carter discovered that the royal mummy was in serious trouble. Centuries of oils poured over the body during the original burial had reacted chemically inside the sealed coffin, creating what Carter described as a kind of slow, spontaneous combustion, essentially cooking the linen wrappings from the inside out over thousands of years. The mummy was pitch black. The oils had hardened into a resin so dense it had fused Tutankhamun's body to the bottom of the innermost coffin, a solid gold coffin like concrete. Attempts to separate the mummy by placing the coffin in the desert sun for hours, reaching temperatures of nearly 150 degrees Fahrenheit, failed completely. The mummy didn't budge. What followed was an examination that, by modern standards, would be considered extraordinary in its invasiveness. The team had no choice but to work with what they had. The body was studied in sections. The torso was separated at the hips. Arms were disarticulated. The head had to be detached from the mask using heated knives. Every section was treated with hot paraffin wax for stability, and limbs were later reattached. Gold caps were found on the fingers and toes. Solid gold sandals were on the king's feet. 50 pieces of clothing were folded around the body, all of the highest quality linen. 130 walking sticks of ebony, gold, and ivory were found in the surrounding chambers. Chariots, board games. Perfume still faintly detectable after 30 centuries. And through all of it, a mummy that had survived the rise and fall of empires, the invasion of Rome, the arrival of Christianity and Islam and modernity, only to be permanently altered in the first weeks of the 20th century by the very people who came to honor it. The damage done to King Tut's mummy during that examination is irreversible. What Howard Carter's team saw, touched, and altered in 1925 cannot be undone. Which is precisely why the debate over Nefertiti's potential chamber behind the wall carries so much weight today. Because the scientific community knows better now than it did then. They know the cost of getting it wrong. They know what it means to open something you can't close again. And so the radar scans continue, non-invasive. Careful, patient. Because if Nefertiti really is behind that wall, if the most powerful missing queen in ancient history has been sitting just meters from the world's most famous tomb this entire time, then the only thing worse than never finding her would be finding her the wrong way. The Valley of the Kings has already given us one lesson in what happens when discovery moves faster than caution. The question now is whether, after 100 years, we've finally learned to listen to it.